The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. Christopher brushed off his workday weariness as he walked in, placing his keys on the console table by the door. It was an ordinary evening, or so it seemed. He had picked up the kids from their extracurricular activities earlier and dropped them off at a friend's house for a sleepover, giving him and Jessica a rare evening alone. The sun cast long, golden rays through the living room window, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the air. Christopher decided to grab a drink before heading upstairs to shower. He had just passed the living room when a voice, Jessica's voice, made him pause mid-step. At first, he didn't think much of it. Jessica was always on the phone, chatting with friends, planning PTA events, or coordinating the never-ending social calendar of their family. But this time, something in her tone stopped him cold. It was low and conspiratorial, with a sharp edge that set his nerves on end. He stepped closer to the kitchen door, careful not to make a sound. "Just a few more months," Jessica was saying. "Once Chris finishes paying off the kids' tuition, I'm done. I'll file for divorce." The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. Christopher's mind stalled, refusing to process what he'd just heard. Divorce? Jessica was planning to leave him? He leaned closer, his breath shallow, his heart thundering in his chest. "It's all lined up," she continued. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. The plan is solid. I'll say he was abusive, he won't fight back. Chris never does. He's too worried about appearances. He'll fold just to keep the kids from being dragged into court." Christopher clutched the doorframe for support, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. Abuse? She was planning to accuse him of something so vile, so alien to his nature? His head spun as she laughed, a light, cruel sound he never heard from her before. "Marcus can't wait to move in," Jessica said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "He keeps joking about how he'll finally get to live the high life, all on Chris's dime. The alimony will more than cover us, and with the house in my name after the settlement, we'll be set." Marcus. The name registered like a second blow. Christopher clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had known Marcus for years, met him at a company holiday party Jessica had insisted they attend. Marcus was charming, always ready with a joke or a compliment, but Christopher had never suspected anything beyond that. He cursed himself now for not seeing it. The glances, the inside jokes, the sudden enthusiasm Jessica had for events Marcus also happened to attend. Jessica's tone shifted, becoming almost giddy. "The best part? Chris is so busy working and being the perfect provider that he doesn't have a clue. He's so predictable. Honestly, it's pathetic." Pathetic. The word echoed in Christopher's ears, more cutting than any insult he'd ever endured. He fought the urge to burst into the kitchen, to confront her, to demand answers. But something held him back, a cold, calculated instinct he didn't know he possessed. If he walked in now, he'd give her the upper hand. She'd lie, spin a story, and he'd be left with nothing but his anger. Instead, he stepped back, retreating silently down the hall to his office. His breathing was shallow, his heart hammering against his ribs. He shut the door behind him and sat heavily in his chair, staring blankly at the family photo on his desk. It was a candid shot from their last vacation. They were at the beach, the kids laughing as Christopher and Jessica stood arm in arm, the ocean shimmering behind them. It felt like a lifetime ago. His mind raced, replaying every interaction with Jessica over the past few months. Had there been signs? Subtle clues he'd missed? He thought of her recent shopping sprees, the girls' nights. That seemed more frequent, the way she'd started keeping her phone close, always face down on the counter. At the time, he dismissed these things, chalking them up to the ebb and flow of a long marriage. Now, they painted a stark picture of betrayal. The words Jessica had used, abuse, predictable, pathetic, stung the most. He had always prided himself on being a steady, reliable husband. He worked long hours to provide for his family, ensuring their children had every opportunity to succeed. The private school tuition alone was a testament to his sacrifices. And now, that very dedication was being twisted, weaponized against him. Christopher ran a hand through his hair, the strands damp with sweat. He felt sick. His wife, his partner of 15 years, the woman he had built a life with, was plotting to destroy him. To take their children, their home, his reputation. And for what? A man like Marcus, who flitted from one job to another, always chasing the next big thing but never staying long enough to accomplish anything? For the next hour, Christopher sat in his office, alternating between waves of anger, despair, and disbelief. He thought about their children, Emily and Jack, both so full of life, so trusting. They adored their mother, and why wouldn't they? Jessica was attentive and warm, always the picture of maternal perfection. But the thought of her dragging them into a manufactured courtroom drama, poisoning their minds with lies about him, filled Christopher with a fury he'd never known. By the time he heard Jessica's footsteps approaching, he had resolved to play the long game. He straightened in his chair and grabbed a random document from his desk, feigning focus. When the door creaked open, he glanced up, forcing a neutral expression onto his face. "There you are," Jessica said, leaning against the doorframe. She smiled, a practiced, familiar smile that now seemed hollow. "I was wondering where you went." "Just catching up on some work," Christopher replied evenly. "How was your call?" Jessica's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Oh, just Julie. You know how she is, always going on about her new diet or yoga class." Christopher nodded, suppressing the surge of anger that threatened to surface. He had to tread carefully now, to gather his thoughts and plan his next steps. Confrontation would come, but not today. Today, he would watch, listen, and prepare. Jessica lingered for a moment, as if searching for something in his face. When she didn't find it, she shrugged and walked away, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Christopher waited until he was sure she was out of earshot before exhaling slowly. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss he hadn't known existed. He turned back to the family photo on his desk, his jaw tightening. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain: Jessica had underestimated him. She thought he was predictable, pathetic. But she was about to learn just how wrong she was. Christopher woke the next morning with a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He had barely slept, his mind running in endless circles as he tried to process what he had overheard. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, his exhaustion had been replaced by something else entirely, a cold, steely resolve. The house was quiet. Jessica had already left for her morning yoga class, a ritual she had adopted over the past few months. It was part of the facade, he realized now, a way to justify the increasing time she spent away from home. He stood in the kitchen, his coffee growing cold in his hands as he stared out the window. The backyard, where his children had once played on sunny afternoons, felt like a memory from a different life. He needed answers, real answers, not the lies she would spin if he confronted her now. With a deep breath, Christopher set his mug down and reached for his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. "Daniel, it's Chris," he said when the line picked up. "I need a favor." Daniel was a friend from college, a tech-savvy consultant who had a knack for uncovering secrets. Christopher explained the situation in vague terms, careful not to reveal too much over the phone. "I'll text you the details," he finished. "But I need this done quietly." Daniel didn't press for more information, only promised to look into it. When the call ended, Christopher felt a flicker of relief. He wasn't alone in this, at least not entirely. For the rest of the day, Christopher went through the motions of his usual routine. He ran errands, paid bills, and checked in with the kids, who were still at their friend's house. He smiled and nodded in all the right places, but inside, he was a storm waiting to break. Every time his phone buzzed with a new message, his pulse quickened, hoping it was Daniel with an update. It wasn't until late afternoon that Jessica returned. She breezed into the house, her gym bag slung over one shoulder and her phone in hand. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek ponytail, and she radiated the casual confidence of someone who believed she had the world in the palm of her hand. "Hey, honey," she called out, her voice bright. "How's your day been?" Christopher looked up from the paperwork he had spread across the dining table. "Busy but good," he replied evenly. "How about you?" "Oh, you know, the usual," she said, dropping her bag onto the floor and heading to the fridge. "Yoga was great. I ran into Marcus at the cafe afterward. He's thinking about starting yoga himself. Can you imagine?" She laughed lightly, but Christopher felt a sharp pang in his chest. Marcus. Even his name was like a splinter under the skin. He kept his face carefully neutral, nodding as though he didn't have a care in the world. "That's great," he said. "Good for him." Jessica poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, her eyes scanning him. "You seem different," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Everything okay?" Christopher forced a smile, though it felt like his face might crack under the strain. "Just tired," he said. "Long week." Jessica studied him for a moment longer, then shrugged. "Well, don't work too hard. We've got Emily's recital coming up next weekend, remember?" "I remember," he said. He always remembered. After dinner, Jessica disappeared into the bedroom, leaving Christopher alone in the living room. He sat in the dark, the flicker of the TV playing across his face, but he wasn't watching. His mind was elsewhere, replaying every interaction, every subtle clue he had ignored over the years. The way she had grown more distant. The sudden need for independence. The late-night text messages she claimed were just work. Around midnight his phone buzzed. It was Daniel. "Got something. Call me when you can." Christopher's hands shook slightly as he dialed the number. Daniel picked up on the first ring. "It's worse than you thought," Daniel said without preamble. "I've been looking through her phone records, emails, and social media. She's been in contact with Marcus for at least a year, texts, calls, you name it. There are hotel bookings, dinners, even a shared vacation you didn't know about." Christopher swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the phone. "What else?" "She's got a separate bank account," Daniel continued. "Been funneling money from your joint account into it for months. It's under her maiden name. If I had to guess, she's been preparing for this for a while." The words hit Christopher like a blow to the chest. A separate bank account? He thought of the late nights he had spent balancing their finances, meticulously planning for their children's future, only to realize that Jessica had been siphoning off money for herself. "There's one more thing," Daniel said hesitantly. "She's been working with a divorce lawyer. The emails are pretty damning. She's building a case to take you for everything." Christopher closed his eyes, the weight of the betrayal crashing over him. But amidst the pain, something else stirred, a burning determination. Jessica thought she had him cornered, but she didn't know the man she was dealing with. "Send me everything," Christopher said, his voice low but steady. "Every email, every document. I need all of it." "Already done," Daniel said. "Check your inbox." When the call ended, Christopher opened his laptop and began reviewing the files. Each piece of evidence was like a nail in the coffin of their marriage, but it also strengthened his resolve. He wouldn't let her destroy him, not without a fight. By the time the sun began to rise, Christopher had a plan. He would be methodical, careful. He would gather every shred of evidence, every detail that would prove her betrayal and protect his children. Jessica wanted to play games, but she had underestimated him. She thought he was predictable, weak. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. Christopher spent the next several days immersed in preparation. Each action was deliberate, each choice calculated. He moved through his life as if nothing was amiss, all while quietly setting the stage for what was to come. He had no illusions about what he was up against. Jessica was methodical and manipulative, but she wasn't invincible. The files Daniel had sent him became his lifeline. He pored over every document, noting key dates, suspicious transactions, and details about the places Jessica had been. The paper trail was damning: a hotel receipt from a weekend he'd spent on a business trip, restaurant bills for romantic dinners he had never attended, and the slow but steady siphoning of their joint savings. All the while, Christopher kept his emotions tightly in check. Anger and betrayal were luxuries he couldn't afford right now. One evening, as Jessica chatted idly about Emily's upcoming recital, Christopher nodded and smiled in all the right places, concealing the firestorm brewing inside him. He had become an actor in his own life, playing the role of the devoted husband while secretly dismantling the web Jessica had spun around him. The first step in his plan was securing his financial position. Jessica had already set up a secret account under her maiden name, funneling funds for months. Christopher's first move was to meet with a financial advisor, a no-nonsense woman named Teresa who specialized in protecting assets during contentious divorces. "You've got a strong case," Teresa said as they reviewed the records Christopher had compiled. "She's been embezzling from your joint account, which, given the volume and frequency, can easily be construed as fraud. But you need to move fast. The longer she has access to your finances, the more damage she can do." Christopher nodded. "What do you suggest?" "Freeze the account," Teresa replied. "You'll need to set up a separate account in your name alone and reroute any income streams. Your goal is to make it impossible for her to continue taking money without you noticing." By the time he left Teresa's office, Christopher felt a flicker of satisfaction. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He followed her advice meticulously, taking steps to secure his paychecks and investments. Jessica wouldn't know it yet, but her free reign over their finances had just ended. Next came the legal groundwork. Christopher met with a divorce attorney, a sharp-witted man named Paul who came highly recommended. Paul had a reputation for being ruthless, and Christopher wanted someone who could match Jessica's cunning step for step. "She's banking on the idea that you'll roll over and let her take everything," Paul said after reviewing the evidence. "The abuse claim is a classic tactic. She's hoping to scare you into a settlement." Christopher's jaw tightened. "And if I fight back?" Paul smiled thinly. "You have the advantage. The documentation you've provided proves infidelity, financial misconduct, and intent to defraud. Combined with witness testimony, if needed, you're in a strong position. But this won't be easy. Are you prepared for a fight?" "I am," Christopher said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes." Paul leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Good. Then let's begin." The hardest part of Christopher's plan was staying calm in Jessica's presence. Every time she smiled at him or asked about his day, he had to suppress the urge to confront her. He kept reminding himself that patience was his greatest weapon. She thought she was in control, and the longer she believed that, the more careless she would become. Jessica continued to play the role of the devoted wife, oblivious to the trap closing around her. She still attended yoga classes, went on girls' nights, and hosted dinner parties where she and Marcus exchanged sly glances that they thought no one noticed. Christopher saw it all but kept his silence. He was no longer the unsuspecting husband she had taken for granted. He was watching, waiting. One Saturday evening, Jessica announced she was going to meet friends for dinner. Christopher feigned disinterest, nodding as he scrolled through his phone. The moment she left, he sprang into action. Daniel had provided him with software to clone her phone, allowing him to access her messages, call logs, and even her GPS history. It was all there. The late-night texts to Marcus, the plans for their future, and most damning of all, her detailed notes about how she would frame Christopher as abusive. She had even rehearsed lines to use in court, painting herself as the victim of his supposed temper. Christopher felt his hands shake as he read through her messages. The betrayal cut deeper with every word, but he forced himself to focus. This was evidence, proof of her lies, her manipulations. He took screenshots, saved files, and backed everything up to multiple secure locations. Jessica would have no idea what was coming. The next morning, Jessica was unusually cheerful, humming to herself as she prepared breakfast. Christopher watched her from across the room, his expression carefully neutral. "Good mood today," he said casually. Jessica smiled over her shoulder. "Just looking forward to a relaxing day. It's been a busy week." Christopher nodded, suppressing the bile rising in his throat. Her lies had become so effortless, so ingrained, that she didn't even flinch. It was infuriating, but he took comfort in knowing her facade wouldn't last much longer. That evening, as Jessica scrolled through her phone on the couch, Christopher excused himself and went to his office. He locked the door behind him and opened his laptop, reviewing the files he had compiled. The evidence was airtight, the foundation of his case solid. But he wasn't just preparing for divorce, he was preparing to expose Jessica for who she truly was. He thought of Emily and Jack, his children who adored their mother. How would they feel when they learned the truth? He hated the idea of shattering their innocence, but he knew he had no choice. Jessica had shown no hesitation in using them as pawns in her scheme. If she was willing to manipulate them, Christopher would have to fight to protect them. As the clock struck midnight, Christopher leaned back in his chair, exhaustion tugging at his edges. The plan was in motion. The pieces were falling into place. Jessica thought she had him cornered, but she was about to find out just how wrong she was. The following week was a masterclass in controlled tension. Christopher moved through his days like a man on a mission, his every action precise and deliberate. Yet outwardly, he maintained the image of the devoted husband, the very persona Jessica was counting on to keep him blind to her schemes. He knew the performance couldn't last forever, but for now, it was his greatest weapon. Jessica, oblivious to the trap tightening around her, carried on as though nothing had changed. She still laughed over dinner, still gave him perfunctory kisses when she left for yoga, and still played the role of the perfect mother when Emily and Jack were home. But Christopher noticed the cracks in her facade, subtle at first, but unmistakable. It started with the way she glanced at him when she thought he wasn't looking, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. Then there were the quick, whispered phone calls she made from the porch, her tone sharp and urgent. Christopher didn't press her for details. He wanted her to think he was still clueless, still the predictable, oblivious husband she believed him to be. One evening, as Jessica prepared dinner, Christopher received a call from his lawyer, Paul. He stepped out onto the patio, his voice low as he listened. "I've filed the preliminary documents," Paul said. "We're officially in motion. I've also drafted a restraining order in case she tries to claim abuse. With the evidence you've provided, it's highly unlikely a judge will believe her story, but we need to be prepared." Christopher exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "What about the kids?" he asked. "I don't want them caught in the middle of this." Paul's tone softened. "It's inevitable to some extent, Chris. But with the documentation we have, emails, texts, financial records, we can argue for sole custody if it comes to that. Judges don't look kindly on parents who weaponize their children in divorce proceedings." Christopher nodded, his resolve hardening. "Do it. Whatever it takes." When he returned to the kitchen, Jessica was setting the table, her phone conspicuously absent from her usual spot on the counter. She glanced up as he walked in, her expression curious. "Who was that?" she asked, her tone light. "Just work," Christopher replied smoothly. "Nothing important." Jessica studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "You're working too much these days. You should take a break." Christopher forced a smile, biting back the urge to retort. Instead, he sat down at the table and played his part, all the while counting down the days until the house of cards Jessica had built would come crashing down. That weekend, Christopher executed the next phase of his plan. With the kids at a friend's house for a sleepover, he used the quiet evening to retrieve a recording device he had discreetly installed in the kitchen. The device had captured hours of conversations, most of them mundane, but there were gems among the recordings, snippets of Jessica discussing her plans with Marcus. "She's careless," Daniel had said when he first recommended the device. "People let their guard down when they're in familiar surroundings. She'll slip up eventually." And slip up she had. As Christopher replayed the recordings that night, he heard Jessica recount her plans to Marcus in chilling detail. "I'll make sure it looks legitimate," she said in one recording. "The bruises don't have to be real, they just have to look real. And once the restraining order is in place, he'll have no choice but to agree to my terms. Christopher clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he listened. The audacity, the cruelty, it was almost too much to process. But he forced himself to stay calm, to remember that he was building a case, not reacting impulsively. Every word she spoke was another nail in the coffin of her lies. By Monday morning, Jessica's suspicions seemed to grow. Over breakfast, she watched Christopher carefully, her smile more strained than usual. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her voice tinged with something that might have been worry, or perhaps fear. "Everything okay?" Christopher nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Just busy," he said. "Work's been demanding." Jessica's eyes lingered on him, as if searching for cracks in his calm exterior. When she found none, she nodded and turned back to her coffee, though Christopher could tell she wasn't convinced. As Jessica left for yoga later that day, Christopher watched her car disappear down the street, then retrieved the files Daniel had sent him. It was time to share his findings with Paul. He uploaded everything to a secure folder and sent it off, knowing that every document, every text message, and every recording brought him one step closer to victory. By midweek, Jessica began to unravel. The first sign came when she returned from her usual yoga class in a foul mood, slamming the door behind her. "Something wrong?" Christopher asked, feigning concern. Jessica glared at him, her composure slipping for the first time. "Just a bad day," she snapped, brushing past him. "Nothing to worry about." But Christopher knew better. He could feel the shift in the air, the way her confidence had started to waver. She was sensing that something was off, though she couldn't yet pinpoint what. It was only a matter of time before she made a mistake. That weekend, Christopher received a call from Paul. "Jessica's lawyer contacted me," Paul said. "She's filed the initial paperwork for the divorce." Christopher's stomach twisted, but he had expected this. "What's her angle?" he asked. "Standard accusations," Paul replied. "Abuse, emotional neglect. But we've got the upper hand. She doesn't know we've been building a case." Christopher nodded, his determination solidifying. "Then let's move forward." When he hung up, he sat in silence for a long moment, the enormity of what lay ahead settling over him. He thought of Emily and Jack, of the life he had worked so hard to build. Jessica wanted to destroy it all, but he wouldn't let her. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, to let her win. By Sunday night, the cracks in Jessica's demeanor had widened. She was more irritable, snapping at small inconveniences and retreating to the bedroom for long stretches of time. Christopher watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. As he sat alone in the living room that evening, reviewing the files one last time, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The storm was coming, and Jessica had no idea just how prepared he was. The tension in the house had become palpable. Jessica's once flawless facade was beginning to crack, and Christopher could feel her growing unease. She moved through the house with a kind of nervous energy, her eyes darting to him whenever she thought he wasn't looking. She was playing defense now, sensing that the balance of power was shifting, though she couldn't yet understand how. For Christopher, the time to act had come. He had spent weeks gathering evidence, securing his finances, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Now, with Jessica's initial divorce filing in hand, he had the perfect opportunity to take control of the narrative. On a quiet Monday morning, Christopher paid a visit to Paul's office. The walls of the high-rise firm were lined with bookshelves filled with legal texts, but Paul's desk was uncharacteristically sparse. Christopher sat across from him, laying out the finalized evidence he had gathered. "She filed for divorce," Christopher said, his voice steady. "She's accusing me of abuse." Paul smirked, flipping through the files. "As expected. But with what we have here, those claims won't hold up in court. These recordings, the text messages, the financial records, this is gold. The court won't just see her as untrustworthy. They'll see her as manipulative and malicious." Christopher leaned forward. "What's the next step?" Paul tapped the folder thoughtfully. "We counterfile, and we include the evidence of infidelity, financial misconduct, and her plans to fabricate abuse. If she tries to push her narrative, we'll be ready to dismantle it. But we'll do more than defend, we'll go on the offensive. We'll ask for sole custody of the kids, full ownership of the house, and a judgment against her for the misappropriation of funds. Christopher nodded, the weight of Paul's words settling over him. It wasn't just about protecting himself anymore. It was about ensuring that Jessica's actions didn't destroy their children's lives. That evening, Christopher returned home, his resolve stronger than ever. Jessica was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone. She glanced up as he entered, her expression guarded. "You're home late," she said. "Had a lot on my plate today," Christopher replied, his tone neutral. Jessica studied him for a moment before returning to her phone. Christopher watched her out of the corner of his eye, noting the way her fingers tapped nervously against the counter. She knew something was brewing but didn't yet realize how close the storm had come. The next morning, Christopher executed the first strike. He arranged for the divorce countersuit to be served to Jessica at her favorite cafe, a place she frequented with Marcus. The timing was intentional. He wanted her to feel the weight of his actions in a setting where she felt secure. Jessica's reaction was exactly as Christopher had hoped. That afternoon, she burst into the house, her face flushed with anger. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, slamming the legal papers onto the kitchen counter. Christopher looked up from his laptop, feigning confusion. "What's what?" "This countersuit," she snapped. "You're accusing me of fraud and infidelity? Are you serious?" Christopher stood, his expression calm but firm. "Jessica, I know everything. The secret bank account. The messages with Marcus. Your plans to accuse me of abuse. It's all documented." Jessica's face went pale, the fight draining out of her as she stared at him. "You've been spying on me?" she said, her voice trembling. "I've been protecting myself," Christopher replied. "You thought you could lie and manipulate your way into taking everything I've worked for. But I'm not going to let that happen." Jessica's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. "You're twisting things," she said finally. "This isn't what you think." Christopher laughed bitterly. "Don't insult me, Jessica. I've seen the receipts, the messages, and the recordings. You made your plans very clear." For a moment, Jessica looked like she might argue, but then she deflated, her shoulders slumping as she leaned against the counter. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want a fair divorce," Christopher said. "You leave the house, I keep primary custody of the kids, and you take responsibility for the money you siphoned off. No lies, no fabricated accusations." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "And if I don't agree?" Christopher's gaze hardened. "Then we take it to court, and I let the judge see everything. Your affair. Your financial misconduct. Your plans to frame me as abusive. Do you really think they'll side with you after that?" Jessica stared at him, her expression a mix of anger and fear. "You're not the man I married," she said finally. Christopher's jaw tightened. "And you're not the woman I thought I married. But here we are." The days that followed were tense. Jessica vacillated between compliance and defiance, sometimes acting as though she might concede, only to push back with a renewed sense of entitlement. Christopher remained steadfast, refusing to let her manipulate him. Meanwhile, Paul continued building their case. He filed motions to protect Christopher's assets and secured temporary custody of the children. Jessica's lawyer tried to delay the proceedings, but Paul's aggressive strategy left little room for stalling. The children, thankfully, remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil unfolding around them. Christopher went out of his way to shield Emily and Jack from the tension, maintaining as much normalcy as possible. He helped Emily practice for her recital and cheered Jack on at his soccer game, all while carefully navigating the emotional minefield that Jessica had created. Late one evening, Christopher sat alone in his office, reviewing the latest court filings. The quiet of the house felt oppressive, a reminder of the life that had once existed here. But as he looked at the evidence laid out before him, he felt a glimmer of hope. This was no longer a story of betrayal. It was a story of survival, of reclaiming control over his life. He thought of Emily and Jack, of the life he wanted to build for them, free from the toxicity Jessica had brought into their home. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in weeks, Christopher felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for his family, for their future. And he wouldn't stop until he had won. As the days turned into weeks, Jessica's demeanor grew increasingly erratic. The confident, composed woman Christopher had once known was now replaced by someone unpredictable and desperate. Her failed attempts to regain control of the situation only added to her frustrations, and Christopher knew it was only a matter of time before she lashed out. It began subtly, small acts of defiance that she likely thought would unnerve him. She'd forget to pay her share of the utility bills, leave dishes piled in the sink, or speak to him in icy tones when the kids weren't around. Christopher, however, refused to rise to her bait. He had learned to channel his emotions into strategy, keeping his focus on the bigger picture. Jessica's lawyer, however, was not as subtle. Paul called Christopher into his office one Thursday morning with an update that turned his stomach. "They've filed a formal response," Paul said, sliding a document across the desk. "And it's exactly what we expected. Jessica is doubling down on the abuse accusations." Christopher skimmed the filing, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. The document was filled with outright lies, painting him as a volatile, controlling husband who had created a hostile home environment. Jessica had even included fabricated accounts of incidents where Christopher had supposedly lost his temper, though there were no police reports or witnesses to back up her claims. "She's hoping to scare you into a settlement," Paul said. "It's a standard tactic in cases like this. But she has no evidence." "You do." Christopher nodded, though the weight of the situation was impossible to ignore. He had spent his life building a reputation as a kind, steady, and dependable man, and now Jessica was trying to dismantle it in a matter of weeks. The thought of those lies becoming part of the official record was unbearable. "What do we do?" Christopher asked, his voice tight. Paul leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. "We stick to the plan. You've already done the hard part, gathering evidence. These claims won't hold up in court, especially with the documentation we have. But we'll need to address the court directly to refute them." Christopher exhaled slowly, the weight of Paul's words settling over him. He wasn't just fighting Jessica anymore, he was fighting for his name, his integrity, and his children's future. The fallout from Jessica's counterattack came swiftly. Word of the allegations spread through their social circles, aided by Jessica's carefully crafted narrative. Mutual friends began to distance themselves, their once warm greetings replaced by awkward silences or strained conversations. Even Christopher's colleagues at work seemed hesitant, their concern masked by professionalism. Christopher bore it all in silence, refusing to let Jessica see how much her actions hurt him. He knew that defending himself in the court of public opinion was futile. His vindication would come in an actual court, where facts, not rumors, mattered. One afternoon, Christopher picked up Emily and Jack from school, their chatter filling the car with a welcome sense of normalcy. Emily was excited about her upcoming recital, while Jack regaled Christopher with stories about his latest soccer practice. For a moment, Christopher allowed himself to forget the storm brewing at home. As they pulled into the driveway, Emily hesitated, her expression unusually serious. "Dad," she said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," Christopher replied, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Mom said," Emily trailed off, biting her lip. "She said you're mad at her, and that's why she's moving out. Is that true?" Christopher's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Jessica had begun planting seeds of doubt in the children's minds, using them as pawns in her twisted game. He forced himself to respond calmly, choosing his words with care. "Emily," he said gently, "your mom and I are going through some things right now. But no matter what happens, we both love you and Jack very much. That will never change." Emily nodded slowly, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade. Jack, oblivious to the gravity of the conversation, had already unbuckled his seatbelt and was halfway out of the car. Christopher watched his children run into the house, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he couldn't shield them from everything. That evening, Christopher received another call from Paul. "We've been granted a preliminary hearing," Paul said. "It's our chance to push back against Jessica's claims and present the evidence we've gathered." Christopher felt a surge of relief. The hearing would be his opportunity to set the record straight, to expose Jessica's lies for what they were. But it also meant stepping into the spotlight, opening himself up to scrutiny and judgment. "I'll be ready," Christopher said, his voice firm. The night before the hearing, Christopher sat alone in his office, reviewing the files one last time. The recordings, the text messages, the financial records, they were all neatly organized, ready to be presented in court. But even as he prepared for the battle ahead, he couldn't shake the weight of what had been lost. He thought of the life he and Jessica had built together, the moments of joy and love that now felt like distant memories. He thought of their children, caught in the crossfire of a war they hadn't asked for. And he thought of Jessica herself, the woman he had once trusted implicitly, now a stranger he could barely recognize. As the clock ticked past midnight, Christopher closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Tomorrow would be a turning point. He would face Jessica in court, armed with the truth and the strength of his convictions. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. The storm was far from over, but Christopher knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't stop fighting until justice was served. The courthouse buzzed with quiet activity, the air thick with tension. Christopher sat in the waiting area outside the courtroom, his mind running through everything he and Paul had prepared. The polished floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting his determined expression. Jessica's accusations loomed over the day like a dark cloud, but Christopher was ready to face the storm. Paul sat beside him, reviewing a stack of documents for the final time. "We've got this," he said, his voice steady. "She's going to play the victim, but the evidence is on our side." Christopher nodded, though his chest felt tight. This hearing wasn't just about proving Jessica's lies, it was about protecting his children, his reputation, and everything he'd worked so hard to build. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and Christopher followed Paul inside. The space was austere, with high ceilings and rows of wooden benches. Jessica was already seated at the opposing table, her lawyer whispering something in her ear. She glanced over her shoulder, meeting Christopher's gaze with a carefully rehearsed mix of defiance and vulnerability. Christopher felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to remain calm. He wasn't here to match her theatrics. He was here to present the truth. The judge, a stern woman with sharp features and an air of authority, entered the room, and the hearing began. Jessica's lawyer was the first to speak, delivering a polished but baseless argument that painted Christopher as a controlling, abusive husband. Jessica played her part perfectly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as her lawyer detailed the supposed emotional torment she had endured. Christopher clenched his fists under the table, forcing himself to remain composed. He knew this was all part of their strategy, an attempt to paint him as the villain and sway the court's opinion before he had a chance to respond. When it was Paul's turn, he approached the bench with quiet confidence. "Your Honor," he began, "my client has been the victim of a calculated smear campaign. The accusations against him are not only false but are part of a deliberate attempt to manipulate the court and gain an unfair advantage in these proceedings." Paul's presentation was masterful. He methodically introduced the evidence Christopher had gathered, recordings of Jessica discussing her plans to fabricate abuse claims, text messages between her and Marcus detailing their affair, and financial records showing her misappropriation of funds. The recordings, in particular, were damning. As Jessica's own voice filled the courtroom, outlining her plans to frame Christopher and exploit him for financial gain, her composed exterior began to crack. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting toward her lawyer, who was visibly struggling to maintain his composure. When it was Christopher's turn to testify, he rose from his seat and approached the stand. His hands were steady as he was sworn in, his voice calm as he recounted his version of events. He spoke about the sacrifices he had made for his family, the love he had poured into his marriage, and the pain of discovering Jessica's betrayal. But he never once stooped to the level of her accusations, instead relying on the evidence to speak for itself. The judge listened intently, her expression unreadable. But as Paul cross-examined Jessica, it became clear that the tide was turning. Under pressure, Jessica faltered, her carefully constructed narrative unraveling as Paul exposed inconsistencies in her story. "Mrs. Harper," Paul said, his tone measured but unyielding, "can you explain why your version of events doesn't align with the recordings we've just heard?" Jessica hesitated, her face pale. I didn't mean those things," she stammered. "I was venting. I was angry. Angry enough to fabricate abuse claims and discuss framing your husband in court?" Paul pressed. Jessica's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The judge raised a hand, signaling for silence. "I've heard enough," she said, her tone firm. When the hearing concluded, Christopher felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The judge had granted temporary custody of Emily and Jack to him, citing Jessica's behavior as detrimental to their well-being. Her request for a restraining order had been denied, and the court had ordered a full investigation into her financial misconduct. Jessica left the courtroom without looking at him, her face a mask of humiliation and rage. Christopher watched her go, his heart heavy despite the victory. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. That evening, Christopher returned home to find Emily and Jack waiting for him. They ran to him as he walked through the door, their laughter filling the house with a warmth that had been missing for weeks. For the first time in a long time, Christopher felt a sense of peace. As he tucked them into bed, Emily looked up at him, her eyes serious. "Are we going to be okay, Dad?" she asked. Christopher smiled, smoothing her hair. "Yes, sweetheart," he said. "We're going to be just fine." In the days that followed, Christopher worked with Paul to finalize the next steps in his case. Jessica's hold over their lives was weakening, and Christopher was determined to ensure that she couldn't harm them any further. But he also knew that there was still much to be done. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was no longer walking it alone. With his children by his side and the truth on his side, Christopher felt ready to face whatever came next. The days after the hearing marked the beginning of a new chapter in Christopher's life. The weight of Jessica's betrayal was still there, an ache that flared when he least expected it, but it no longer consumed him. With temporary custody of Emily and Jack secured and Jessica's false claims unraveling, Christopher felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in weeks. He poured his energy into rebuilding his life, focusing on his children and their well-being. Their laughter, their trust, it reminded him why he was fighting so hard. They were his anchor, his reason to push through the storm Jessica had unleashed. Jessica, on the other hand, was unraveling. The court's investigation into her financial misconduct had unearthed even more evidence of her schemes, and her lawyer had begun pressing her to settle. The reality of her situation was sinking in, and for the first time, she realized she was losing. One evening, she showed up at the house unannounced. Christopher had just finished helping Emily with her math homework when the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find Jessica standing there, her eyes rimmed with red. "Chris," she said, her voice trembling. "Can we talk?" Christopher stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "What do you want, Jessica?" he asked, his tone firm but calm. "I made a mistake," she said, wringing her hands. "I was angry and I didn't think things through. I just want to fix this. For the kids." Christopher studied her, searching for any trace of sincerity. But all he saw was desperation, the realization that her plans had failed and she was out of options. "This isn't about the kids," he said evenly. "It's about you. You made your choices, Jessica. Now you have to live with them." She flinched at his words, but he didn't relent. "I'm not going to let you manipulate me anymore. If you truly care about Emily and Jack, you'll stop using them as pawns and start focusing on being a better mother." Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but Christopher didn't waver. He had spent too long being blindsided by her lies, and he wasn't about to let her twist the truth again. The final court hearing came 3 weeks later. Jessica, under mounting pressure from her lawyer and the court, agreed to a settlement. Christopher would retain primary custody of the children, the house would remain his, and Jessica would have limited visitation rights until she completed a court-mandated parenting program. The financial judgment against her was significant, requiring her to repay the funds she had siphoned from their accounts. Her relationship with Marcus had also imploded under the strain, leaving her isolated and resentful. As the judge read the final ruling, Christopher felt a surge of relief. It wasn't just about winning, it was about justice. Jessica had tried to destroy him, but she had underestimated his resolve. He had fought back, not out of spite, but to protect what mattered most. Life after the court battle was far from perfect, but it was peaceful. Christopher threw himself into his role as a father, creating a stable, loving environment for Emily and Jack. He started cooking with them on weekends, teaching Emily how to make pancakes and helping Jack build model rockets in the backyard. The house, once filled with tension, now felt like a home again. One evening, as the three of them sat on the couch watching a movie, Emily leaned against Christopher and smiled. "I like it when it's just us," she said quietly. Christopher kissed the top of her head, his heart full. "Me too, sweetheart." Months turned into a year, and the wounds Jessica had inflicted began to heal. Christopher found himself rediscovering joy in the small things: a quiet morning with a cup of coffee, a bike ride with the kids, the simple pleasure of a life free from deceit. He had learned to trust himself again, to recognize his strength and resilience. Jessica, meanwhile, had faded into the background of their lives. She still saw Emily and Jack during her supervised visits, but her influence over them had waned. They saw her for who she was, and while they loved her as their mother, they no longer idolized her. On a crisp autumn evening, Christopher stood in the backyard, watching Emily and Jack chase each other through the fallen leaves. The golden light of the setting sun bathed the scene in warmth, and for the first time in a long time, Christopher felt truly content. He had lost so much, but he had gained something far more valuable: clarity, freedom, and the unbreakable bond he shared with his children. Jessica's betrayal had been a devastating blow, but it hadn't defined him. Instead, it had forged him into someone stronger, someone who refused to be broken. As he called the kids in for dinner, Christopher smiled to himself. The storm had passed, and a new dawn had arrived. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together.